The story begins long before the lights of Chicago. It begins in the quiet, sleepy farming town of Gilmanton, New Hampshire. In the year 1861, a boy was born named Herman Webster Mudgett. To his neighbors, he was just a normal child. He was intelligent, obedient, and perhaps a little too quiet. But Herman had a secret. He was terrified of the local doctor's office. Specifically, he was terrified of the human skeleton that hung in the corner of the examination room. It haunted his dreams. But one day, everything changed. A group of older bullies dragged young Herman into the doctor's office. They forced him face to face with the skeleton. They grabbed his small hands and made him touch the cold, dry bones. They expected him to scream. They expected him to cry. But Herman didn't cry. As he touched the bones, something inside him shifted. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, dark fascination. He realized that death wasn't something to be feared. It was something to be studied, something to be controlled. From that moment on, the boy named Herman was gone. A predator was beginning to wake up. As he grew older, this obsession with death led him to the University of Michigan Medical School. On the surface, he was a brilliant student, but in the shadows, he was already practicing the art of deception. The medical labs were full of cadavers, dead bodies donated for science. For Herman, they were an opportunity for profit. He began stealing bodies from the lab. He would take them to quiet locations and disfigure them, breaking bones and burning skin to make them look like victims of terrible accidents. Then, using fake names, he would collect insurance money on these relatives he claimed had died. He wasn't just stealing money, he was learning. He was learning how to manipulate the system. He was learning that a dead body was just an object, a piece of merchandise with a price tag. By the time he graduated, he had a medical degree in one hand and a trail of fraud in the other. He had wives he had abandoned, creditors chasing him, and laws he had broken. He needed to disappear. He needed a place where a man could reinvent himself completely. He needed Chicago. In 1886, Herman Mudgett stepped off a train in Chicago. But Herman Mudgett didn't leave the station. The man who walked out into the busy streets introduced himself as Dr. Henry Howard Holmes. Chicago was the perfect place for a man like him. It was a city exploding with growth. The air was thick with coal smoke and the smell of the stockyards. Trains roared overhead. Millions of people were pouring into the city. Immigrants, workers, travelers, everyone was a stranger. Holmes loved it. In a city this chaotic, people were disposable. If someone went missing, no one asked questions. He found his way to the suburb of Englewood. It was a busy, up-and-coming neighborhood. He walked into a drugstore on the corner of 63rd and Wallace Streets. It was run by an elderly woman named Dr. Holton. Her husband was dying of cancer, and she was struggling to manage the store alone. Holmes saw his first target. He used his greatest weapon, his charm. Holmes applied for a job as her assistant. He was polite, hard-working, and handsome. The customers loved him. Dr. Holton thought he was a savior sent to help her in her time of need. When her husband finally passed away, Holmes made his move. He offered to buy the drugstore from her. He didn't have the money up front, of course. He promised to pay her in installments and allow her to live in the upstairs apartment for the rest of her life. It was a generous offer, or so it seemed. She signed the papers. But months went by, and Holmes never paid a dime. When Mrs. Hulton began to complain, when she threatened to go to the police or sue him, she simply vanished. One day, the neighbors asked where the old woman had gone. Holmes smiled his warm, reassuring smile and told them she moved to California. He said she had relatives there, and the warm weather would be better for her health. It was a lie. Dr. Hulton never made it to California. She likely never made it out of the building. She was the first casualty in Holmes's war on humanity. Now Holmes was the owner of the store, but as he stood on the sidewalk, looking at the large, empty lot across the street, his ambition grew. A small drugstore wasn't enough. The World's Fair was coming to Chicago. Millions of tourists would need a place to stay. Holmes didn't just want their money, he wanted their bodies. He decided to build a hotel on that empty lot. But it wouldn't be a normal hotel. It would be a machine designed for murder. The building that rose from that lot was unlike anything Chicago had ever seen. It was a massive, imposing structure, stretching 3 stories high and spanning an entire block. The locals watched in awe as the red brick walls climbed higher and higher. They started calling it the Castle, a nickname that fit its fortress-like appearance. But while the exterior was impressive, the interior was a masterpiece of madness. From the very first day of construction, Holmes was obsessed with secrecy. He hired a crew of carpenters and bricklayers, let them work for a few weeks, and then abruptly fired them all without pay, claiming their work was sloppy. He would then hire a completely new crew to continue the job. He repeated this process over and over again. To the workers, he was just a greedy, difficult boss trying to save money. But this was a calculated strategy. By constantly rotating the workforce, Holmes ensured that no single person ever saw the full blueprints. No one knew how the hallways connected. No one knew where the staircases led. Only Holmes held the master key to the layout. As the building neared completion, the true horror of his design remained hidden behind the walls. The ground floor was deceptively normal, housing a new pharmacy, a jewelry store, and a restaurant to lure in passers-by. But the upper 2 floors were a labyrinth designed to disorient and trap anyone who entered. If you were a guest walking through the 2nd floor, you would find yourself in a nightmare of architecture. There were hallways that turned at sharp, nonsensical angles, causing you to lose your sense of direction. There were staircases that led up to the ceiling and stopped dead. There were doors that opened to reveal solid brick walls, and others that opened into drop-offs to the floor below. It was a maze, and Holmes was the minotaur at its center. But the confusion was just the beginning. The rooms themselves were weapons. Holmes had designed several soundproof bedrooms, lined with asbestos and steel plates, so that no scream could ever escape. Some rooms had no windows at all, creating a suffocating darkness. But the most terrifying feature was invisible. Hidden inside the walls were gas pipes that fed directly into the guest rooms. The control valves for these pipes were located in Holmes's personal bedroom. At any moment, he could turn a knob and silently fill a guest's room with lethal gas, killing them in their sleep without ever stepping inside. He could end a life without even getting out of bed. He also installed peepholes in the walls and secret panels that allowed him to watch his victims in their final moments. He wanted to see the panic. He wanted to see the life drain from their eyes. And once the deed was done, Holmes had solved the problem of moving the bodies. He didn't need to drag heavy corpses down the stairs where they might be seen. He had installed large, greased chutes-like laundry chutes that ran from the upper floors straight down to the basement. With a simple push, a body would slide silently down into the darkness, landing in his secret laboratory below. The basement was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire castle. It was equipped with an operating table, a crematory kiln large enough to burn a human body to ash, and pits filled with quicklime and acid. This was where Holmes did his post-mortem work. Sometimes he would destroy the bodies completely. Other times, he would meticulously strip the flesh from the bones, clean the skeletons, and sell them to medical schools and universities, often the very same ones he had attended. He was selling his victims back to science, turning a profit on their death just as he had planned. By 1893, the World's Fair was ready to open. The castle was complete. It stood as a dark stain against the celebration of the White City. Holmes placed advertisements in newspapers, offering clean, affordable rooms for tourists and young women looking for work. He described it as a place of comfort and luxury. The sign swinging above the door welcomed travelers from all over the world. The spider had finished his web, and now he stood at the door, smiling, ready to welcome the flies. The guests began to arrive, suitcases in hand, unaware that they were checking into a tomb. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893 was in full swing, and Chicago was a city of dazzling lights and endless noise. But inside the walls of the castle, on the corner of 63rd and Wallace, there was a different kind of atmosphere. It was quiet, a suffocating silence broken only by the muffled sounds of the streetcars outside. The hotel was open for business, and the guests were checking in. Many of them were young women, drawn to the city by the allure of independence and adventure. They saw Dr. Holmes as a protector, a wealthy and charming man who offered them employment and affection. They didn't know they were walking into a machine designed to consume them. Among the first to fall into his orbit was Julia Connor. She wasn't a tourist. She was the wife of Ned Connor, a man Holmes had hired to work at the jewelry counter downstairs. Julia was beautiful, vulnerable, and unhappily married. Holmes sensed her dissatisfaction like a shark senses blood in the water. He began to court her right under her husband's nose. He charmed her, showered her with gifts, and eventually she and her daughter, Pearl, moved into the castle. Ned Connor, suspecting the affair and terrified of his boss's strange behavior, eventually quit and fled the city, leaving his wife and child behind. He was the lucky one. Julia believed she had won. She believed Holmes was going to marry her. But then she told him she was pregnant. For a man like Holmes, a child was a complication, a liability. He promised to perform a simple medical procedure to help her, a surgery that would ensure their future together. On Christmas Eve, Julia and little Pearl went into the operating room in the basement. They never came out. Holmes later told tenants that Julia had died during an abortion and that he had hidden the body to avoid a scandal. In reality, he had stripped her skeleton and sold it to a medical college in Chicago for $200. As for little Pearl, her body was never found, but her clothes were later discovered in a trunk stained with blood. But Holmes didn't stop with Julia. His appetite was insatiable, and his methods were evolving. He hired a young, radiant woman named Emmeline Sigrand as his personal secretary. She was described by everyone who knew her as the most beautiful woman in the building. Holmes seduced her, promising her marriage, promising her the world. On the day she was supposed to leave to visit her family in Indiana, Holmes invited her into his office to retrieve some documents from the walk-in vault. The vault was airtight, lined with steel. As soon as Emmeline stepped inside, Holmes swung the heavy door shut and spun the combination lock. There was no air vent, no way out. He didn't gas her. He didn't shoot her. He simply sat outside the door and listened. He listened to her pounding on the steel. He listened to her begging. He listened as the oxygen slowly ran out, and her screams turned to gasps, and then to silence. Her footprint was later found etched into the enamel of the vault door, a desperate, final mark of her terror. Then came the Williams sisters, Minnie and Nanny. Minnie was an heiress from Texas, possessing land worth a fortune. Holmes saw her not as a lover, but as a bank account waiting to be drained. He romanced her, and she fell deeply in love, completely unaware of the monster behind the mask. She invited her sister Nanny to visit Chicago and meet her wonderful fiancé. Nanny came, and for a while, the three of them toured the World's Fair together. They saw the Ferris wheel, the electric lights, the wonders of the age. It was a perfect summer, but Holmes was working. He manipulated Minnie into transferring the deed of her Texas property to him. Once the ink was dry on the documents, the sisters became expendable. Nanny was the first to disappear, likely suffocated in one of the airtight rooms. Minnie followed shortly after. Holmes told people they had gone east for a wedding. In reality, he had buried them in the basement, covering their bodies with quicklime to speed up decomposition. He killed them for their money, but he also killed them because he could, because it gave him a sense of godlike power. By the time the leaves began to turn in the autumn of 1893, the castle was a hive of horrors. People were vanishing at an alarming rate. A stenographer here, a hotel guest there. Holmes was operating with a terrifying efficiency. He was juggling multiple mistresses, multiple frauds, and multiple murders all at once. He was selling skeletons to universities, claiming insurance money on fake deaths, and stealing the assets of the women he killed. But the chaos of the World's Fair couldn't last forever. In October, the exposition ended. The tourists went home. The lights of the White City were turned off, and suddenly the flow of victims slowed down. The easy money stopped, but the creditors didn't stop. They were banging on his door. The insurance companies were becoming suspicious of the fires that kept breaking out in his properties. The families of the missing women were hiring private detectives. The walls were closing in on the castle. Holmes realized that his time in Chicago was up. He had pushed his luck as far as it would go. The neighbors were talking. The police were asking questions about the smell coming from the chimneys. It was time to run. It was time to take his show on the road. But he had one final horrific scheme in mind. A plan that would involve his loyal business partner, Benjamin Pitezel, and a tragedy that would span across 3 states. He set fire to the top floor of the castle in a desperate attempt to collect one last insurance payout, packed his bags, and fled into the night, leaving the charred remains of his torture chamber behind him. The devil was loose in America. The year was 1894. Holmes had left the smoking ruins of his castle behind in Chicago, but he brought his darkness with him. He was now a drifter, moving from town to town, leaving a trail of bad checks and stolen horses. But petty crime wasn't enough to sustain his lifestyle. He needed a big score. He needed one final masterpiece of deception. He turned to the only man he trusted, his longtime accomplice, Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was a carpenter, a father of 5, and a man who had done Holmes's dirty work for years. He knew Holmes was a criminal, but he didn't realize he was a monster. Holmes pitched him a plan. They would travel to Philadelphia, where Pitezel would fake his own death. They would find a cadaver, dress it in Pitezel's clothes, and disfigure the face. Mrs. Pitezel would collect the $10,000 life insurance policy, and they would split the money. Pitezel agreed. He thought it was just another fraud. He didn't know that to Holmes, he was already dead. On a cold morning in September, a body was found in a rented house in Philadelphia. It wasn't a fake cadaver. It was Benjamin Pitezel. He was lying on the floor, his face charred beyond recognition, surrounded by broken glass and chemicals. Holmes had chloroformed him and set him on fire while he was still alive. The police ruled it an accident, an explosion caused by a scientific experiment gone wrong. Holmes arrived on the scene, playing the role of the concerned friend. He even brought Pitezel's teenage daughter, Alice, to identify the charred corpse of her own father. It was a level of cruelty that was hard to comprehend. But the horror was just beginning. Holmes now had the insurance money, but he also had a problem. Pitezel's wife, Carrie. She was waiting for her husband to come out of hiding. Holmes couldn't let her know the truth, so he spun his most sickening web yet. He told the grieving widow that her husband was alive and in hiding in South America. He convinced her that it wasn't safe for the whole family to travel together. He suggested that he take 3 of the children, Alice, Nellie, and little Howadan, travel separately to meet their father. Desperate and trusting, Carrie agreed. She handed her children over to the man who had just murdered their father. What followed was a road trip from hell. Holmes took the children on a dizzying journey across the United States and into Canada. They went to Cincinnati, Indianapolis, Detroit, and Toronto. At the same time, he sent Mrs. Pitezel on a parallel route, constantly moving her so she would never catch up. He was playing a sick game of cat and mouse. The children, innocent and confused, kept asking when they would see their papa. Holmes would smile and say, "Soon." But the law was finally catching up. The insurance company smelled a rat. They hired the Pinkerton Detective Agency to track down the fraudster. The case landed on the desk of a tenacious detective named Frank Geyer. Geyer wasn't just doing a job. He was a man on a mission. He began to retrace Holmes's steps, town by town, hotel by hotel. It was a haunting task. In every city, he found traces of the children. He found hotels where they had stayed. He found people who remembered the sad-looking children traveling with the charming doctor. But as Geyer moved closer, the trail went cold. He arrived in a small rental house in Toronto. The neighbors remembered the man and the two little girls, Alice and Nellie. They remembered that the man had borrowed a shovel from them. Geyer went into the cellar of the house. The earth was soft. He began to dig. A few feet down, his shovel hit something hard. It wasn't treasure. It was the decomposing bodies of Alice and Nellie Pitezel. They had been forced into a large trunk and gassed to death. Holmes had buried them in the dirt floor of a stranger's house. Geyer was horrified, but he knew one child was still missing. Little Howard, the boy, was gone. Geyer backtracked to Indianapolis. He searched dozens of rental properties until he found a small cottage in Irvington. The local pharmacist remembered Holmes coming in to buy drugs. A repairman remembered Holmes asking about sharpening some knives. Geyer went to the cottage and found a wood-burning stove in the corner. Inside the stove, amidst the ashes, he found a small, charred human jawbone and teeth that belonged to a young boy. Holmes hadn't just killed Howard. He had cut him up and burned him in the stove like firewood. The nationwide manhunt exploded. The press dubbed him the Archfiend. Holmes was eventually captured in Boston, completely unaware that Geyer had found the bodies. He thought he was being arrested for horse theft or insurance fraud. He denied everything. He spun wild tales. He claimed the children were in England with a secret lover, but the evidence was overwhelming. The jig was up. The man who had built a castle of death was finally in chains, and the world was about to look into the eyes of pure evil. With Holmes sitting in a prison cell in Philadelphia, the police back in Chicago finally had the probable cause. They needed to raid the castle on 63rd Street. For years, the building had stood as a silent fortress, but now its secrets were about to be ripped open. When the authorities entered the basement, they weren't prepared for what they found. It was a house of horrors that defied imagination. They discovered the large brick crematorium that Holmes had used to burn his victims. Inside the stove, they found pieces of human bone, a watch belonging to a missing child, and charred scraps of clothing. They found the acid vats, dried and stained. They found a dissection table covered in old, dark bloodstains, along with surgical tools that had clearly been used recently. Under the floorboards, they unearthed a mass of human ribs and hips, too many to count. The press descended on the scene, dubbing it the Murder Castle. The headlines screamed of a blue beard living in their midst. The entire nation was captivated and repulsed. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the trial of H. Holmes began in October 1895. It was a media circus. Holmes, ever the narcissist, loved the attention. He dismissed his lawyers, choosing to represent himself for parts of the trial. He was calm, articulate, and utterly unbothered by the gruesome evidence presented against him. He treated the courtroom like a stage, smiling at the jury and flirting with the female reporters in the gallery. He seemed convinced that he could charm his way out of a death sentence, just as he had charmed his way into his victims' lives. But the evidence of the Pitezel children was damning. The jury didn't buy his act. They saw a cold-blooded killer. It took them late into the night, but they returned with a verdict, guilty of murder in the first degree. Holmes was sentenced to death by hanging. Even while awaiting execution, Holmes tried to manipulate the narrative. The Hearst newspapers paid him $7,500, a small fortune at the time, for his exclusive confession. Holmes gave them a story, but it was a mix of truth and lies. He claimed to have murdered 27 people. He listed names, dates, and methods. But in a final act of cruelty, he included names of people who were actually still alive, just to confuse the police and terrorize the public. However, amidst the lies, he wrote a chilling passage that would become his legacy. I was born with the devil in me. I could not help the fact that I was a murderer, no more than the poet can help the inspiration to sing. The end came on the morning of May 7th, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison. Holmes ate a light breakfast and dressed calmly. He showed no fear. As he stood on the gallows, he denied killing the Pitezel children until his very last breath, a final lie to the world. The trapdoor opened, but Holmes didn't die instantly. His neck didn't break. He strangled slowly for nearly 15 minutes, twitching and gasping before finally falling silent. The devil in the White City was dead, but he had one final, bizarre request. Holmes was terrified that doctors would dig up his body and cut him up for science, doing to him exactly what he had done to so many others. So, he left specific instructions for his burial. He ordered his coffin to be filled with cement and buried 10 feet deep, covered by another layer of cement. He wanted to be encased in stone, untouchable forever. As for the castle itself, it didn't survive long. In August of 1895, while Holmes was still in prison, a mysterious fire broke out in the building. Witnesses said they saw 2 men running from the scene. The roof collapsed, and the upper floors were gutted. Some say it was arson by neighbors who wanted to erase the evil from their street. Others say it was an insurance scheme gone wrong. Today, a post office stands on the site. Thousands of people walk over that ground every day, completely unaware that beneath their feet once lay the most terrifying house in American history. H. Holmes was a man who turned the American dream into a nightmare. He used the technology and progress of the 19th century to build a machine of death. He remains a reminder that sometimes the monsters aren't hiding under the bed. Sometimes they are standing right in front of us, smiling, opening the door, and inviting us in.